Let me know when things are open and we can get started.
Yep, we're live.
Okay, cool. All right. Welcome, everyone. Hello, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. Really excited to host this fourth panel under Performance Matters series from GameBench. And for those who don't know me, I am Sri Kannan Iyer. I am one of the founders of GameBench, and I have spent for the past 15 years in the dev and QA side of gaming and the mobile industry. Today's topic must be close to a lot of people's hearts. A lot of cooler side conversations if they still happen. But we're going to talk about dev QA culture today. And to talk about this interesting, exciting topic, we have assembled a really cool set of panelists from different organizations that you all must have heard of. And these are QA and dev leaders I've known for a while. They're experts in the field. Today, I would like to start by introducing Matt Huard from Double Loop Games, ex-WB, a very good friend of mine, and here on the panel, Brett Schmidt from Riot Games, Alex Stokes from Epic, Clifton, Wilcox from Glue Mobile, and I'll let them introduce themselves in a little while. And just to set the tone for what we are going to talk about today, besides the dev QA culture in organizations and how to go towards the performance by design. From hyper-casual runners to aesthetically rich open-world RPGs and competitive multiplayer shooters, mobile game performance is vital to player experience. We sort of know all of this, given the amount of time we spend during COVID playing games. No matter what genre of game you're crafting, the pressure to put out new features and content can allow minor quality issues to pile up until they're too difficult and costly to get ahead of. To ensure player-first performance, we can adopt a quality by design culture to become performant by design. It can be a challenge to bring this idea to your teams. Here, we'll talk with veteran game developers and QA about specific challenges they've faced and what they've done to overcome them in their journey towards performant by design. And on that note, I'd like to hand this over to my colleague, Aaron Wilson from GameBench, who's also a head of product, and who joined us from Big Fish Games to lead our product development, and is also leading our ideology behind performance by design. So over to you, Aaron. I'll let you run this.
All right, Sri, thank you so much. I think the first thing that comes to mind when we're talking about things like quality and performance is, we tend to focus on the technical bits and bobs. How does it work, and how do we fix things, and what solution do I need to implement? And what I found over time is that we can have a great deal of knowledge about how to fix things technically, but sometimes the environment that we're in, the behaviors that we engage in, they don't align with those outcomes, right? So that passion of mine, I found in these other folks here on the panel too. And so we want to talk about what it is that makes a culture breed performance and breed quality. And what does this word culture even mean, right? And to put a real fine point on that, when we talk about culture, we're not necessarily talking about whether you've got a work from home policy or a drinks table or a snacks table or anything like that. We're talking about the day-to-day behaviors of a team working together, and what does that look like, and how do they interact, and that defines the working culture. And more often than not, we find impediments in the way that we work together when we're trying to go for creating quality by design and creating things that are performant by design. And so on that note, I want to open with Matt. And Matt, I've heard your name for a long time, and I'm so glad to be able to chat with you about this in some depth. And just leading off, what are some of the top non-technical challenges that you've encountered in trying to hit these goals?
Yeah, good question. So you mentioned culture, right? I think one of the things I think of there is that, shifting from, like you say, this mindset of it's a technical problem, right? I think performance is everyone's problem. And by adopting or saying we want a culture that is going to embrace this idea of good performance, we have to allow that to influence our processes, and in some sense not leave everything until the end, which is, I think what a lot of places ultimately end up doing, right? And so, but there's sort of a lot that can be impacted. So first of all, one of the things I think of is, what do we mean by performance, right? How do we develop a shared definition of what that is? Because to me, it's not just frames per second, right? It's things like everything that impacts the user's experience, like responsiveness to input, how well are we masking latency, and then, down to things like, if you're on mobile, how warm does the phone get and how quickly does the battery drain? How much data are we consuming, right? So these are all sort of considerations. And I think, you say you want performance, and then, I think there's some effort in sort of describing what that means to you. And it's a difficult thing because we know that bad performance can impact the business, but it's very difficult to quantify, right? So kind of setting your targets is a little bit of a subjective experience. So there are challenges there. And I think then you sort of get into the hard work of how do we go about doing this, right? The idea of not leaving performance till the end means that, you're thinking about it from the beginning all the way through the project, right? And so when do we set budgets? There's probably a period that's too early, right? As the game is in sort of an exploratory mode. If we spend a lot of effort describing our targets and ultimately the game pivots, then, we're sort of introducing inefficiencies. And then sort of, when do you start enforcing your performance budgets, right? And again, I think that you have to sort of find the timing that's right for you. And then, you spend a lot of time describing your targets, just thinking about what good performance is. How do you know if you're on or off target, right? So what techniques are you using throughout the cycle, your development cycle, to know whether you're on or off target? This is a challenge because usually, the act of profiling is reserved for people with specialized tools, right? And their manual time. And that doesn't happen build over build, right? And as the game grows, this becomes a sort of more time consuming effort. So you need to think of things such as automation or using GameBench or a tool like that to raise awareness for the product. Just trying to think of some other sort of challenges. Yeah, and I think in general, being sensitive to how clear the vision is for the game. Again, you always have to be ready for the risk of the game pivoting, and your budgets, are sort of built on this foundation of a design. And if that changes, and oftentimes it does change in games, right? This is sort of like a subjective endeavor. You're kind of back into this sort of realm of rethinking everything. We may have produced a bunch of final art that now has to be, redone to match the new design and meet our performance budget. So those are some of the things that come to mind.
Yeah, I mean, to your point there, Matt, like I've personally seen a game's core loop, like the core mechanics change 6 times in about 9 months. Right. So like thinking about that idea of what are our budgets and when can we define them? I want to put that in a little slightly different language for some folks that might be listening to this. So like if you are making, let's say, a hyper casual runner, right? Your memory budget, for example, would be much lower, right, than if you were making a real-time first-person shooter on mobile. Right. And that's the extremes of what we're talking about. But even within a particular genre, there's this idea of like, well, what's the aesthetic going to be? And given that aesthetic, like, am I going to have a shiny, clean, sparkly world? Is it going to be very animated, or am I going to have something tough and gritty? And all of those subtle aesthetic changes also radically change the capabilities that need to be available, right? So I want to make sure that I caught those sort of high points there that you mentioned. One was, what is the target? What does it mean to have high performance for a particular game? And when can we define that? and when should we define that? That's a very loose thing, right? And then there's the measurement problem. When do we start measuring? How do we measure? How do we get this feedback quickly? And there's the question of alignment on that, whatever that combination of things are.
Right. Yeah, and I guess the one thing I would add there as well is you could argue that not introducing performance problems is probably the best approach overall. So what sort of standards do we put in place across the team, right? And again, it's not just an engineering problem. When a designer is proposing some feature, should we already be thinking about how this could affect performance, right? And so do we have a review process, coding standards, content creation standards? So I think trying to reduce the instances of bad performance overall is a good strategy.
Yeah, and I mean, to touch on that, knowing what kind of game you're trying to make is super important, right? Like you talked about the runner, where your controls are going to need to be super tight, and you may not care as much about graphics or art direction, which is going to inform you as to what kind of sacrifices you can make. Because if you can't give up, say your runner is sessions of 1 hour, you can't give up battery life anymore. It's just not possible. So you need to be accounting for that early. And then of course, design's going to change. You're going to get UX feedback, and you realize your audience is pretty different from what you thought it would be. But you can always pivot at that point if you've already been setting standards for what you want. It's a lot easier to make that change if you know where you are already.
Yeah, I think there's a cogent part of this too, which is when you're talking about the context of the game that you're creating, the trade-offs that you're going to have to accept in performance for some of those things will become clear. So if you're aiming for something that's 3D and photorealistic, you're going to have to, adjust your budgets for those things based on what your design intent is behind that game. And that can help drive technical decisions and things like that down the road. But from a culture standpoint, having everybody on the same page about the goal of the project when it gets to the consumer's hands, I think will help in a big way to determine how to set those budgets and when to start tracking those things.
So on that, have any of you found really effective ways to sort of communicate and align and get everybody on board what the performance vision for a particular game that you've worked on?
Yeah, so one of the things that I've started to try and do more and more is when you're goal setting, I try to define both a data focused goal, which is pretty obvious and standard in the industry now, but also an intent focused part of that goal. So you actually write down and immortalize for everybody what the intent of your goal is. So you may be targeting 60 FPS, but your intent is we're making a first person shooter that we want the competitive audience to find really appealing and enjoyable to play. And you understanding that then lets you come down and say, okay, well, honestly, the rocket launcher is just super fun and interesting. So even if it drops us to 50 FPS because of the explosions, maybe we're willing to make that sacrifice. And it helps you have better context for both design focused people and data focused people on what you're doing and why. So that's like an easy win that I've been trying to preach.
Awesome. There's something there that I think would be great to dive into, which is like that. I don't know if we should do it right now, but the idea of the metrics versus the feel, how a game feels, right? And the data, like you said, we might be willing to take that 10 FPS hit because it feels good and the explosion is awesome, and there's a lot of, just it works, right? And getting those sort of subtleties understood across an entire team, right? Like I've personally done things where I've had people play games, right? Just not as a tester, but like, go play these games. These are the competitors. And what does it make you feel, right? And does it feel fluid? Does it feel snappy? Like, these are different ideas, and they come across differently, but just culturally aligning on what this should feel like. That's a powerful thing. So I'm gonna move to this next one, because I know that we could talk forever just about this, right? And Clifton, I'm gonna put this one to you. So I think that you and I have both been through an evolution in mobile gaming, where when I started in mobile, it was sort of understood that you released, something minimal, and you could put that out and test it in a limited geo and then build features, but that's not the case today anymore, right? Today, you have to release with what the market expects when you go worldwide anyway. And it's got to have all of the social stuff. It's got to have, clans or guilds and, persistent data across devices and all of these capabilities, right? So the demand of the player competes a bit with our priorities. And especially when we're talking about quality early in a process, and there's so much that's changing right up until that point. How do you effectively balance priorities between quality and having a complete set of features to release to your players?
I think one of the main things that I've tried to push with my teams or influence with my teams has been a culture of just UAT testing. So a lot of playtesting culture and a lot of like competitive analysis, like you were just mentioning, sort of playing other competitor games and getting the experience of the feel of those games. So throughout the process of developing a first MVP and doing those limited releases and things like that, I think that still does exist in large part in the industry, but when getting to worldwide release and deciding that last 10% of features that were really stoked to get out to customers, but can't necessarily get to the finish line at the right time. I think there's as long as you have a playtesting focused culture and your relationships are good with your project partners, having those discussions about what can wait till a 1.1 patch or what would drive the most value to a customer and would have the least amount of impact on the overall experience of the player, I think is the right conversation to be having with project partners throughout that process. So getting QA in early allows us to help to iterate or make the iteration process through the software development lifecycle faster. But I think the other thing that it allows us to do is build a collective consciousness about what our goals for the first release or that worldwide release is and how we want customers to feel about that. So driving that playtesting culture with all of our project partners, including designers, PMs, producers, anybody who touches the project on our projects generally is involved in playtesting in some way. And given that, it allows us to sort of crowdsource within our own disciplines and within our own experience as game players to talk more directly about the experience of playing the game and if it's performant and if those features are really necessary for that first release or if we can actually wait.
Yeah, playtesting can be super powerful, and especially within the organization, right? And getting other people's perspectives and making sure that there's this alignment on the market's expectations, the players' expectations, and what you're trying to achieve with that vision that we talked about. Around the room, are there any other ideas that you've had that you've put into effect to try to balance these competing priorities?
Well, I think I would agree with Clifton. I mean, sometimes you have to make the tough decision to release something that's maybe not as performant as you would like. But I think there are a couple of things you can do early on throughout the process to make sure that you have a good foundation on which to address performance concerns. So if you leave all performance concerns until the end of the project, you sort of only get away with addressing the low-hanging fruit, and what you're left with is possibly issues that are not easy to address. So I think setting a framework that addresses those throughout the project is a main goal. And I think how you do this is a little difficult on some level. The culture has to have faith that good performance means good for the game in the long run, although difficult to quantify. But I do think it's setting the expectation very early, right? And when you're looking at things like roadmaps and project plans, that you've sort of tucked performance mitigate or performance engineering in there so that it's not a surprise at the end, and we're sort of factoring it into the long-term project plan. And so I think that's sort of a main way to stave off and allow yourself the flexibility to address performance concerns after you go live.
And I think to add on to that, you know, you can utilize certain advantages as well. Like if you're developing a game that is a yearly iterative title, you've got tons of information from your previous releases to help guide future decision making. If you've got a game as a service type of title, you might have a customer experience team that knows the community inside and out, can give you insight to the kinds of issues and concerns coming in. If you're developing a brand new from the ground up title, that's where things can get difficult. And that's where definitely I've found the competitive analysis and everything that I've mentioned before, I've found to be extremely useful to help kind of build that profile. Who's going to be playing my game? What are there going to be their expectations? And then ultimately of that game type, what are people going to assume? Like if we have a big open world title, for example, people might be more forgiving about certain performance concerns or even quality concerns because they want the trade-off of having this huge sandbox to play in. If you're in like a shooter, really tight environment and everything that's really Twitch based, well, any performance concern is going to be really heightened because you really need to have ultra smooth gameplay, 60 FPS, consistent all across the board. And so those are some kind of things that I've used and I've kind of observed, through the various types of titles I've been a part of throughout my career.
I can definitely say that, like, there have been times where I've had a team member come to me and say, this game is not ready to release. It's choppy. The loading time is like half a minute, right? And it should be like 10 seconds due to the kind of game it is. I'm talking with the team and they're like, well, we have to release with these features and we need to get this feature in, we need to get this feature in, we need to get this feature in. That particular conversation, how can somebody address that conversation and move it in a different direction, right? Specifically in the human interaction part of it.
I think a big part of that is trying to create framing the source of conflict as outside of the team is a really helpful starting point where you can always guarantee that everyone in the room wants to release a good game. And so when you move it to talking about the audience's expectation or the player's expectations, what is our biggest cost from that front, it becomes a lot easier to collaborate and have that discussion, at least.
Yes.
I think it ties in really well to those early goals. And I think both Matt and Clifton touched on it as well, which is that when you have those goals, you understand what you're trying to deliver to your fan base. And then from there, you can say like, okay, well, we care way more about having a smooth game and less content that we can then deliver later than we care about, having more content. Or if, for example, you're going after if you're going after the North American market, or like even the European market's a great example for networking, maybe you can make sacrifices because that generally people will have more reliable internet there, and you can make sacrifices on network, stability at first in order to get a nice polished experience in their hands that they'll want to keep playing. So,
I think that's you just like rang the gong, Alex, right? Which is that the conflict is not about us and them, right? And that's something that unfortunately, like I've seen, and my colleagues have seen, and my friends have seen in a lot of different studios, is this idea of like, even between dev and QA, a bit of an us and them kind of scenario that develops, right? And it's interesting because it's a bit of the nature of the job, right? There's, when you're in a quality role, you're charged with finding everything wrong with it, right? And then on the engineering side, which I've been on both, so I can empathize a little bit, right? Where, it's, oh, well, this group of people, all they ever do is come to me with problems, right? So like, there's baked into the way that we organize things is a bit of this conflict, but always staying on top of, this isn't about us and them. It isn't about me versus you. This is about our players, right? And we want to give them the best experience possible, right? And, in some way, bring them some joy, right? Like that's why we all that's why we all do this, right? And that means different things to different people, but it I just can't reinforce what you said enough, Alex. I think that's the nail on the head there.
Yeah, I think you're both hitting on something super important, or something I think is super important also, which is that professional friction between those disciplines is something to lean into and keep it on the professional side, obviously. And if we're above board with that, then the personal issues don't tend to be as big and bold and as a major part of the partnership process. So as long as everybody understands the clear roles and responsibilities between those, that friction is sort of what keeps the table upright. As far as the software life cycle. So I think for the purposes of partnership and working with a team, having the conversation about roles and responsibilities and being clear about what our intent for our disciplines is can resolve some of that interpersonal conflict that happens also.
Yeah,
awesome.
And I really think that the culture discussion and those pillars we talked about is paramount to that as well, because it's easy as QA and a quality focus to like always bring a problem. You fix something and then you bring the next problem in line, and the problems get progressively smaller, but you're just as loud about them. Whereas having goals and clear thresholds for what matters becomes way more efficient. It was something I found when testing, compliance for consoles, especially, which is like, I'm not the one that's giving you grief here. I have these requirements that we're both trying to meet, and therefore I'm giving you this report that you don't like, right? And that's super helpful. Whereas if you don't have goals, then you really are you're either bringing problems until you're the problem, or you're not bringing problems and then people get mad at you later for not bringing them up, and then it's a no-win scenario. So,
we actually have a question coming in from the audience from Dan Duffy. So there's a large emphasis on pivoting and iterating towards the performant design vision. I'm curious, is there any tactics and advantages to an indie or smaller studio that allows for a more agile approach to designing and iterating with performance? I think, Matt, you're right there in that scenario. So I'm going to put you on the spot.
Yeah, I think there's no magic bullet. But I do think one thing that is helpful is conceptually drawing the line between prototyping, right, and exploring, and reserving the right to completely throw that away, and your sort of final code, right? And so if you feel you're in sort of a heavy stage of iteration where you're exploring, it's fine to prototype and write things that might not be the most performant. But if you set the expectation that it will be addressed once the ideas are solidified, I think you save yourself a lot of problems there, and you've sort of reserved the time to go ahead and address those. And then the other thing is developing good performance standards, right? And this is touching a little bit on engineering, but because a lot of performance issues can arise there. Can even help in this early stage, right? So even if I'm writing prototyping code, I'm very cognizant of how it will perform, right? And maybe I'm not trying to overemphasize it, but just trying to, in general, keep it to a minimum, performance issues to a minimum. Those are just a couple of ideas that come to mind.
Yeah, go ahead, Alex.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think to add on to that too, I think getting away from the idea of binary thinking for ready, not ready for an area is really good too. Having exactly that, a prototype phase, but then a ready, we want to see how performant this is phase. And then this is actually what we're shooting for phase helps a lot in defining when it should be looked at properly, what that actually means, how it feels. So you have those multiple levels, which we do on a game development cycle, but we don't do with features and levels sometimes. So that can help a lot as well.
I think there's a couple of things here, like that idea of being willing to throw the prototype away, right? And actually being willing to throw it away and learn everything you can from it, But there's another thing here that I find very particular to games, and you all can tell me if I'm hitting the nail here or not. But one of the things that sets game development and enterprise software development apart, one of the differences is that prototyping a game, there's a bare minimum of performance that is necessary to get any kind of useful feedback at all, right? So even when you're in rapid prototyping, there's kind of a minimum bar, and even if you're handing it over to your colleague and saying, does this feel fun? Or you're showing it to a studio VP and saying, this is our game concept, this is our core loop, right? If it barely functions or is completely falling apart, right, it's not going to serve as a good gauge of where things are going to go, right? So again, I think we're back in that world of balancing, finding exactly the bare minimum needed to prototype something and to demonstrate it and to show its fun factor, right? And then going into the iteration toward market expectations.
And that's a tricky one, because it can be deceiving, because you play the prototype, looks good, right, from the outside, even though there may be bad things happening under the surface. So it can be sometimes difficult to, make the case for going back and addressing it later. So I think setting the expectations up front is a good one. So.
I think there's also value in trying to influence like an MVP design culture and implementation culture. And that's something that from a QA standpoint is a little bit hard to do sometimes because we feel a little bit removed. But if we do try to include QA early in the process, we can start to insert some, these would be soft requirements, right? Not actual requirements, but the idea of having performance as a requirement for an MVP, so that the feedback that we get from customers is not tainted by any performance concerns. That's certainly a big deal when it comes to like prototyping on mobile, especially considering the compatibility footprint. And because all of our folks don't necessarily have the best phones. Building that redundancy or that ability to perform across the gradient of phone performance is really, really important for those early builds.
And then being comfortable with QA asking you uncomfortable questions that you're not ready to answer yet. Being ready for that is super important, because they'll point out all those little dark, dusty corners. And maybe it's intended, but maybe they're actually onto something exactly that Matt talked about, which is going to be an underlying problem that's going to, be a thorn in your side 8 months down the road. So.
This is a theme, and it's a good segue into the next sort of main section here. Brett, QA earlier in a game's life cycle. Okay, so it earlier has come up from everybody here, right? And so that's kind of relative, right? It's relative to our experience. We're saying earlier, but we're not saying when that is. So Brett, share with me a little bit about, what does early mean, and what are some of the benefits to getting QA in early, and also some of the drawbacks, right? Because nothing is a silver bullet. So there's got to be benefits, there's got to be drawbacks, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think early, like you said, can be a relative term. We could be talking 3 weeks before we're going to hit alpha, which for some teams is early for them to be bringing in a QA team. And so, I think the benefits are pretty obvious in terms of defect prevention, being able to bake quality into our processes, being able to set certain performance goals or other quality goals throughout the development and gates that the product may get through. But I think above all, or beyond that, you also being able to integrate your team early, being able to build those working relationships, getting people used to and comfortable working with each other for the long haul, I think is also something that is really important and can sometimes be overlooked when we're talking about trying to evolve the QA discipline and the cultures and everything like that. As far as like some of the drawbacks, I think in my experience is the maturity levels of working with QA involvement very early on in the cycle can be all over the place. I've worked with producers and engineers that they have no idea what QA could be or should be doing early on, which of course means that it's a great opportunity for the QA team to really step up and say, this is how we can build quality, this is how we can prevent defects and make things cheaper to fix, because of course, as we're all aware, the earlier you find a bug, the cheaper it is going to be to fix it. And so but then even moving past that, I think that early on, it's not as cut and dry as far as the typical, okay, QA gets in there and tests and tells you what's wrong with the game. It's more, you're kind of getting into some project management, QA management side of things. And so being able to find the right people that can really kind of step in and represent QA in a very small QA org, but still be able to have their influence felt across a larger team. You need to be able to find people that can do that, people that are able to test plan, that are able to work with the teams, come up with KPIs and everything too. And so it kind of speaks to the can we find the right people to fit, and that can also, I think, sometimes be a challenge in that. And so it's there's definitely numerous challenges involved in bringing a QA team early, but the dividends can absolutely be huge. If the team is ultimately bought in and you have the right culture there to really value and take what QA has to say, a year or 2 years before you're even going to release.
I think I was really happy too that you especially hit on like that common language, because that's the most common problem you see when you bring a QA team in late, is then you need to wait for them to actually get a common language and an understanding of what they're doing before they start. And then you're already behind schedule on something that you were behind schedule on. And I think that's super important.
Yeah, I think you hit on a couple of really important things there too. I think one of the reasons I lean into the word partnership a whole lot is because people who are partners don't tend to get upset at each other at a personal level when we start talking about some of these like complex or, maybe even hypothetical issues that QA brings up very early in the process. So, I mean, if you look at the software development lifecycle as sort of a phased operation, even including the QA team in the iteration phase where we're designing features and things like that, can help us in the perspective of building testability into products. And I think that is something that when you start talking about adding testability later, stapling it onto a product as a late addition, you tend to have a lot more issues, especially in games where there's heavy sort of algorithmic level generation or heuristic rewarding schemes and things like that for players. So those present really complex testing problems for teams that don't necessarily have the right tooling. But if the QA team is included early, we can start to influence the process of developing those systems in a way that they can be testable, or at least developing tools alongside them that they can be used. So I think that's a pretty huge thing.
And I'm glad that you mentioned the whole testability thing, and that's definitely something that I overlooked, but I think really can be a great learning opportunity for development types as well. I've worked with engineers and I've just asked them a few basic questions. Okay, you're halfway through the feature. How do we know that this ranking system is going to be correct? What can we do to kind of proof out that the network's going to work and everything? And these are all things that they're like, I don't know. Nobody's ever asked me this before. Maybe I should look into this. And so, but it's really, but they've appreciated it though, because the engineers, I mean, they've come back to me and said, I'm glad you asked these questions. Like I learned a little bit about quality assurance and kind of what's going through your mind as you're verifying these features. So now I can kind of check this kind as well. And so I think that there's definitely some good kind of learning opportunities that we as QA can use to impart upon the engineering team by getting in and asking some of these questions. And it's not because we're trying to make their lives hard, of course. I think it's just that it's part of being QA professional is having that inquisitive nature and wanting to know what's going in and how do we know things are trending and everything in the right way.
Yeah, I think a lot of people that are worried about bringing in QA too early also think about QA 1 month before launch as the QA you're going to get at the beginning, where instead it's actually exactly about that, which is a lot of asking questions, a lot of if-then statements on testability, which is, okay, if you implement this feature, I may need these trackings in debug. I may need this telemetry so that I can actually do my job later. And also documentation. in, I've tested this feature for 3 months now. So when the QA team gets it, in beta, I have a whole bunch of documentation to tell them where the weak spots are, what we need to worry about, what, how we've changed and pivoted and why. And all of that context is really important in the sense that a QA person will have that conversation with the QA team differently than a producer and engineer will, which can be really helpful down the line.
All really good points. And I just wanted to add also, QA getting in there early gives us a chance to set up certain channels of communication, such as crash reporting, or, what is the process around bug reporting. And it sort of touches on what Alex said, sort of that onboarding process for them. And then, there may not be features for QA to test very early on, but if we're sort of testing the architecture or the fabric of our game, I think, again, just to touch on the point that it ideally raises those kind of foundational issues, and we're able to catch and address those early. So I'm definitely a fan of early QA.
I do think there's also one other thing that's really important about getting QA in early, and that's the sort of switch in approach and intent behind the QA process, which early on should be mostly focused around helping the team to continue to iterate as fast as possible. So, helping to look through nightly builds and make sure they don't crash, or, looking at the latest merge request just to make sure that it doesn't slow down the rest of the development process, I think is another key element of having QA early.
Yeah, and just again, to touch on the tooling, I think that is very important. And I think the earlier you talk about it from an engineering perspective, typically what happens is that it influences the architecture of the game. The game has to be built in a way to allow for, things like skipping levels and allowing, external modification of the game state. And it's a good time to start talking about how do we, getting back to the idea of testability, how can we, identify a pattern of defects and in some sense automate the checking of those going forward, so that we free up people's manual time for new things that are sort of rolling off the production line. So critical to get that done early.
One of the things that I love about game QA is that it attracts people from every kind of discipline and every kind of interest. And I think one of the opportunities that we have in this industry is to, especially in this area where we're talking about bringing QA in early, is finding people who, they went to art school, right? Or, they did, they studied graphic animation, right? Or engineering or whatever, but now they're in QA, and being able to say, okay, well, at this stage of the life cycle of the game, right, we're looking for essentially product concept fit, right? Some sort of validation, right? Well, somebody that is really passionate about game design and understanding what players want, you can bring them in early and start testing the concept, right? Not the code, but the concept, and playing other games, competitive analysis that are in that, and taking notes on it and delivering that to the product manager or the producer or whoever, and saying, this is what I found, this is my interpretation of what works in this market, adding to that early quality piece. And depending on your organization, you may have people that just do that if you're big and gigantic, right? But especially if you're smaller, being able to look at who really gets this on this team, right? They might be in QA, but they also are passionate about lots of things, and that's why they're here. They love games, right? So I think that's something where we have an opportunity to shift the culture a little bit and really lean into our people's passions, right?
Yeah, and one thing I'll say from my experience is that a lot of the testing teams I've managed have been full of just hardcore gamers. If you want to know how good of a title you have, you've got a built-in playtesting team through your QA team. I've been at large studios that make competitive games and will do company-wide competitions and everything. And I would say almost every single time they do a competition, one of the finalists, and oftentimes the person who ultimately wins the whole thing comes from QA. And so there's definitely a lot of hardcore, a lot of passionate people that I've seen in QA. And definitely, in my opinion, you'd be a fool not to want to leverage their thoughts, their opinions on what you're building to help you kind of ultimately build something that is going to resonate with the community at large.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think, Aaron, you also hit on something that's really important about what Alex said about vocabulary. So having a diverse team with a diverse set of backgrounds and skills, I think lends a little bit of value to that vocabulary conversation when we start talking about, somebody that's in QA that has some engineering experience, or maybe went to school for customer or computer science, or has a design background, so they can speak the same language as the partners that they're working with, and that should shorten the loop of building that culture and making those relationships better between QA and development.
Yeah, and on the radical side, I'm going to put out a radical thing, and it's not going to work for everybody. But one thing that I did on one of my teams, we had just finished building a pretty large product for our studio, and it was some internal software, and the team was very they were burnt out. It was a hard slog for months and months to get this thing done, and it made a big impact on teams around us, but at the same time they were a bit toast. And so something I did there is I split the team up, and this was about, at the time, I think it was 10 people, 12, somewhere between 10 and 12 people. I split them up into pairs, and each pair just worked on one small little thing that we could deliver to a studio to help with. And it was a dev and a QA, right? So they defined, like, I gave them the top level view of, like, this is what this tool should do. And then just said, design it, implement it, work together, learn how each other talks, learn how you think about the problems. So from, from concept to delivery, it was a dev and a QA that made it happen. And the fascinating thing is that, my manager at the time was like, are you sure about this? Right? And what actually happened is that was the most productive period in terms of releasing useful software to the organization that the team ever really had. And there were times when they'd come to me and say, well, we just spent a week trying to figure out this problem and we did it wrong, and now we have to do it all over again. And I'm like, that's okay, because that's the process, right? Like that, yeah. Coming back to that idea of prototype and throw it away, right? You tried something, and
it's funny learn. Too, because like I've worked with a lot of different studios in my career, and almost pound for pound, every time you work with a studio, like you can almost take the temperature on this one test, which is if a QA person's first instinct is to message an engineer directly with a question, it's going to be great. It's always going to be great. But if their first instinct is to write a bug or to ask their manager, or those barriers still exist where QA is its own little backyard, it's always harder. It's always harder. And when you build those relationships exactly in those kinds of exercises, it completely changes the landscape of your studio. It's actually crazy.
The thing is, like, we should make a list of how to predict an awesome dev QA culture, like what to look for in a job interview.
5 right? Signs that your QA studio is terrifying.
Yeah. Right. sounds like you want to write that one, Alex.
Sure. Publish me. Let's do it.
Sri, we can make that happen, right?
Yeah, go for it, Aaron.
All right.
Yeah, we are 10-minute mark. Let's go for some wrap-up questions, Aaron, so we can actually pull this together. A lot of interesting thoughts so far. We have tons of questions we've prepared, but I'm really happy it became as informal as it should be. You want to pick some final questions for the panel before we see we can pick more from the audience, if there are any?
Well, I think now would be a great time to look to the audience if there's any questions. I know that this group of folks could talk and go a mile deep on any given subject related to games or development or QA. So whether it's directly related to what we're talking about now, or just, studio life, dev life, QA life, it's open.
All right. One question that I had, which I'm going to throw at the panel, being as part of the startup and having worked with all you guys, this difference in terminology, dev QA, it comes up a lot. And I feel that we almost need to term this differently, saying player experience team. And I mean, do QA people not write code? Of course you write code too. And do developers not test the game? Of course they do. How do you really, I mean, I'm looking at the solution, but how do you truly bring this together for the next gen of indies who are going to become big studios going forward? How do you think of it ground up as not a quality assurance team, something has to change here so that this divide doesn't exist. And I feel it'll exist if the names stay as they are today. So I'm just going to throw that out and see, what would you advise for the next gen of studios coming into this, new indies coming into the play, saying, how do we build a culture ground up without thinking of dev or QA separate things?
I think teams feeling siloed is maybe a side effect of, not having a sort of a clear, unified vision of what we're trying to deliver to the players. Like, we're all trying to build a game that's going to be awesome. And the more we can frame it like that, the more we're just all contributing to that. I think it helps, sort of break down some of those walls. And you're right. I mean, having individually named departments probably doesn't help, right? But I think it's acting as a team. I think it's doing frequent play tests together and being, a little subjective about what we're all feeling, and is this going to be the right thing for our audience. There's no real way around it other than embracing the product we're building holistically, right?
Yeah, I mean,
go ahead.
Oh, go for it.
Oh, I was going to say, I think it's really important to start to build a culture around quality as a goal and as a vision for what our products are, because this has been talked about sort of endlessly around QA circles, but I don't think that QA is solely responsible for quality, right? The whole team that touches the product has some impact or influence or ability to influence that quality of the eventual product. So having everybody be culturally aligned around the idea that the test team is not something that you throw things over the wall to and solely responsible for quality, but everybody's inculcated in that process of making sure that the thing that comes off the line is what everybody wants and thinks that the customer is going to appreciate the most. So that's one way to start to break down the divisions between those things as, I'm an engineer, I write code, I'm in QA, I'm responsible for quality, I think is an antiquated notion at this point because, development cycles are so integrated and so quick that if we start to divide those things, we start to build a gulf between ourselves and the experience of the player.
Yeah.
Alex, you're going to say something?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen, QA, QV, QC. I've seen like a lot of different, abbreviations for the departments and things down like that. But more and more these days, I've been thinking, like, I had this simple experience that just completely blew my mind, which was I was working on a team and someone wrote a bug, and then it was assigned to an engineer. Totally normal process so far, but the engineer built 7 subtasks out of that bug, and I didn't understand most of them. But it blew my mind to think that the bug was not the most base element of the thing. And it gave me this beautiful vision of understanding the loop that was happening, right? And I could see him ticking things off and going through it. And, I don't understand all of it, but I suddenly see the output and breaking down those cross-departmental visibilities and barriers as important. For a long time, a lot of people have kept QA kind of towards the end or siloed off. And as soon as you actually break that wall and funnel down and you have information flowing both ways like that, that's exactly what's going to get you to that successful vision, more than, calling it customer experience or customer success or, quality assurance. I think that's like the critical change that I'd love to see going forward.
And it was mentioned earlier, the wide background, you have people that went through engineering school, that went to art school and everything. And so, really leveraging your team and the personnel on your team and getting them into areas that naturally excite them. So if I have somebody that's really excited about art, awesome. That's going to be my QA guy, that person that's going to really be integrated with the art team. And then the onus then is to really keep pushing the envelope as far as what does QA typically do? Well, okay, we're doing this now. How can we make the team's life easier? How can we build in more quality into the title? How can we further integrate that person? I've seen instances where we've even had QA people being the scrum masters of the team, and the team was fully bought in. And that to me was just like the ultimate in really having QA get a seat at the table, be seen as a true partner and driver of the title itself. And so those are some of the things that I've done, and I think can really go a long way in really further breaking down those walls and really having QA just as integrated and important as any other discipline, and why you wouldn't even want to start development without somebody on the QA team.
Yeah, I think that I really like the idea of the QA person. I would love to find a different term, because I think it's been done and dusted over the past 50 years. So we'll find, for the next panel, we'll find a new name, just for the sake of it. But having the QA person as a Scrum Master, I think is a fantastic idea. I think I can really take that as a really good outcome, because without the quality being checked, it cannot leave the door. I mean, that doesn't matter. I mean, I always go with the adage, like, operation was successful, but patient is dead. So there's no point of letting, fantastically written code out of the door if it's not up to the quality mark that the QA team sets, or everyone sets in this sort of team. So going down all the way, knowing what your goal is, and all the way to the entire team sort of pitching in to make sure that the player experience what matters the most, not whether you're in QA or dev or QE or QC, whatever that is it's immaterial. Matt, you wanted to jump in on that, right? Because you are what I call the developer here in the panel. How would you think of rebuilding this culture if you were to talk to a young studio?
Oh gosh, yeah, I think, I think a lot of people brought it up, but moving away from the mindset that QA is, finding defects and categorizing defects. I think that that role, and we need to find a new title, but that role is, there's a lot of responsibility there, and in some sense they are the representatives of the players, right? And so they should have sort of the, I'll call it, authority to determine whether or not the game is good enough to go out, right? And I think that too many places QA is brought in late, and the role is to file bugs, and as we talked about before, that can be not such a great experience, right, if the culture is not set up properly. But I think embracing and realizing that what quality means, right, and not just performance, but everything about the game, and that you have a team of dedicated people to basically, again, represent what the players want, and make sure that what we're releasing is quality. And in some sense, that's a reflection of your culture. And I think players ultimately feel that as well, right, in the experience. So.
Great. There's a question from the panel. I think this one is for Aaron. Thanks a lot for that, Matt. Aaron mentioned earlier about a project's core mechanics changing over 6 times in a short time. Does anyone have any more specific examples of where performance dictated a major design change at a later phase in a project? I think that's a fantastic question.
Yeah, I have a good example fairly recently where there was an element of the game design that had some characters on screen, and we wanted to hit a certain visual quality or fidelity, and so you can imagine setting budgets around that, right? What are we going to see on screen? How many? And that sort of starts to drive your thinking around budgets, memory, bones, all that fun stuff, verts. And then we developed content, and we began building that section of the game. And at some point, the pivot sort of brought up the idea of introducing, I think, 5 times as many of those characters on screen at once. So that's a great example of where, we have to sort of pump the brakes and figure out what we're going to do here. Does art do we throw away what we produced and bring everything down? Do we push back on the design? And so that's a great example of what can happen.
I think this is one of those areas where early QA can help identify in the core concept of what you're targeting. Like if you're making a game that, for example, and this kind of pulls from some experience I have, but I'm going to change the names. If you're making a game where you have an avatar and the whole point is to be able to manipulate and change your avatar, customize it, make it as uniquely yours as you possibly can, right? From the get-go, understanding what that means technically and what the testing challenges are going to mean will prevent you from being in that position where down the line you realize that, wow, this is really complicated. And instead of having a 3D model that I can manipulate all this stuff on, now I'm going to a 2D solution, right? Because of performance reasons. Like this is a thing that, can happen. And now the product is no longer what somebody's vision was for it. Right. And it's no longer going to be unique in the market. So this is one of those areas where I think getting that early QA is really, really critical.
All right. I think we have, anyone else wants to add to that? Matt, you were going to say something?
No, well, I mean, like Aaron said, we could talk about this for several hours, I think.
Cool. I think we're 3 minutes over time. I just want to thank all of you for joining this panel. I know we can talk for hours, and I'm sure I'm going to get requests to have another panel like this. We are going to have another panel focused more on the European market at a friendlier time for them. So again, thanks a lot for your contribution. The video will be available for all of you to watch if you're not able to join this, but please do share the video with those who might be interested in your team or in your organization. And again, if you have any post-event questions, please